Let's talk living situations. In a previous video, you specifically see me stomp on said ground. Now I'm in the basement, which you can hear the dogs above me specifically bark rather loud. In my coexistence within said dogs, in being in said basement, I may as an individual have to essentially create a distraction from them necessarily barking up a storm. You may see me in previous videos specifically tap on said ceiling or specifically stomping on said ground, a point of disruption in their behavior. You can create the same effect within an individual human by simply, and your mind draws a blank. The point of the behavior that I displayed, I would argue, in my essence, I would like to apologize to said viewers. I am not an abusive individual towards the dogs that I coexist with. I love those dogs, but they are a bit much when it comes to simply listening. And when you understand that when you live in a basement that echoes rather very loudly, which if you do not have the ability to essentially create a point to cause them to essentially kind of go, oh, we're losing our shit over everything. In the analysis of my behavior, I may find, once again, apologizing to you as a viewer for displaying said behavior. I will correct that in myself. These are not my dogs, however. And those not being my dogs, I have never laid a hand on them. They're not mine to discipline. All I can do as the basement inhabitant is essentially try to create a noise in said house when these particular dogs essentially create a lot of noise in said house. Which if I don't have the ability to essentially cause them to kind of stop by creating a noise, you might find that once again, I have just displayed an act which could be seen as aggression simply based on stomping my foot. Did I particularly harm a dog at this particular point? No. But now we see the definition of what fear might ultimately be like. Fear is an emotion that disrupts an individual's behavior in their natural path. Within said fear, you might find that upon an individual striking the emotion of fear, this definition is what ultimately means fear. Fear is derived from displaying aggressive behavior, which once you arise to aggressive behavior, you might arise at what emotion is specifically causing said aggressive behavior. By definition, you can exponentially grow the definitions to create an interpersonation. From interpersonation, you can essentially create multiple different meanings, resulting in one thing now meaning a huge list of different meanings, which ultimately, the longer the list, the less the behavior you were allowed to display. Now, in understanding, as an example, that such a thing as Bill C9 might result, as an example, I'm sure some of my viewers may have actively called the police based on me simply stomping said foot to the ground. Now, in said basement, which I am not in any way connected to said dogs, which in my own living habitation, they do not coexist in the basement. They are on the upper floor, which from this point, those whose dog owns, or who owns these particular dogs, I have zero control over said dogs. All I can do is specifically create a point to disrupt their behavior from said basement. Imagine what 2 years of those particular conditions of arising any particular time to dogs exploding at barking at a window, barking at each other, on and on and on. What might that cause? Ultimately, all parties suffer. And as in this example, you might see that my right to be has surpassed the dog's right to be, simply by placing a point of distraction, resulting in fear being experienced. In that particular definition of fear, one might find that in order to specifically drive a point, how might one drive said point? Ultimately, you can act in any way. You can speak any particular truth. We have seen it as acceptable within our Canadian society. I'm simply an example to base said behavior from within said video. In understanding an example, you might understand now what actually causing fear might feel like. You as a viewer felt it based on me specifically stomping said foot within said basement, which within said basement, once again, I have zero control over said beasts. And ultimately, even by sharing this video, one might argue they need to be trained, on and on and on, which I absolutely agree with you. I'm actively trying to train dogs that are not mine. Which once again, based on my personal history, we see the same point I'm not going to get into. In the particular human behavior displayed, you might find that now in Bill C-9, you can actively see that from one particular specific definition, the said list of interpretation and corrective action may now be listed in the interpretation that which you may feel what a particular definition is according to your own interpretation. Now in said interpretation, ultimately, we now see that an individual can specifically, as a result of Bill C-9, any particular time an individual may feel fear results in their path of travel, also known as their life, being impeded. Which even from a particular video, one might say, where is the protective rights action? If every behavior can be broken down into unacceptable behavior based on one particular separating emotions, ultimately we then result in behaviors being infinitely divided into their definition, which the more you read these particular definitions, ultimately you arise at the conclusion that nobody's allowed to act in any particular way, and we have to essentially walk stiff and march. We are not allowed to express in any particular way. We're not allowed to communicate. We're not allowed to have opposing opinions, ideas. We all have to speak the same, think the same, dress the same, because ultimately we are erasing the expression of the individual within the more we dive into the legislation that can be infinitely divided from said Bill C-9. In infinitely dividing unacceptable behaviors that which we then list in legislation, ultimately we see that in the infinite division of unacceptable individual definition of the behavior, which is then broken down and broken down and broken down and broken down based on the interpretation of the individual, which in my own self, doing this to stop a dog from barking above me might not feel like I'm specifically acting out of anger or hatred. But to the viewer, you might now see how that might be interpreted differently within yourself, which ultimately relies on the power of the ethics, the moral compass of the individual, which according to each interpretation of said moral compass, which is where I essentially kind of arise to where I draw my fine line of what is acceptable and not, each individual may now interpret said feeling of what might be fear, which results in an individual then being locked up for a minimum to 2 to 10 years in prison. And in creating infinitive definitions of one particular meaning, the more we list individual separative divisions of said initial meaning, which in order to create legislation you need to stick to the same initial meaning. The definition of each individual word needs to be carried within the entire legislative document, because if it is not, it is a poorly crafted document and can be interpersonated at the individual level, resulting in every single individual ultimately stating everybody is specifically hating everybody. And we all end up in jail at that point. Because what's going to happen? What will happen essentially? Everybody's going to call police on each other, just as the Nazis did. Hey, we got an individual doing this over here. Hey, we got an individual wearing that over here. Hey, we got an individual with a limp over here. Hey, we got an individual that simply might just be telling the truth. And after we arrive at the definition of hatred, which is an emotion that arises the emotion known as hate, a feeling rising the emotion of hate. Ultimately, they don't define actions that may cause in the response of an individual resulting in said hate, which then creates the bias. According to said legislation, you can simply state this is hate, but we do not state what might cause individuals to arise to an emotion of hate, which leaves ultimately the interaction, the point of incident, which according to each individual interpretation, everybody can essentially now make up a particular story, and if it's not consistent, whatever, according to a non-constant definition, we can then interpret any way we want, resulting in said individual being locked up for 2 to 10 years in prison for a misinterpretation. The more we dive into the analysis of said interpretation, which is up for the individual interpretation, even listening, you might personally interpret my message in your own interpretive way. The point I'm ultimately driving to make is that within said legislation, it is a bias. We do not see in the protective act of this particular constitution in the Criminal Acts Code, if the definition of hate is a feeling that arises the emotion of hate, we do not, in the Protective Rights Act, specifically state definitions of particular situations that which an individual, upon experiencing said feeling of, say, feeling threatened or particularly triggered, based on simply being triggered from a statement, a symbol, a piece of clothing, a particular color. Within each of these particular individual interpretations, the individual ultimately left feeling triggered, arising said anger, is now responsible of a hate crime. Now, in the triggeredness aspect of things, where might we find easily triggerable individuals? In children. And within said children, what are we essentially seeing in a particular, you could say, surrendering of the children to said system, surrendering said self to said system, and upon said self being made by said system, we arise then at individuals that were perfectly respondent to the legislation pushing said system, and ultimately we arise at these particular individuals resulting in genocide. The more we try to control particular groups, behaviors, symbols, or ultimately what we like to call in the right, freedom. The more you control each individual's levels of behavior in their expression of the way they dress, the way they act, the way they talk, the way they think, ultimately we arise at there's no more freedom in a liberal society. Because these are liberal ideas being pushed forth, and for the exchange of, say, not voting for conservatives because they're oppressive to, say, women in one particular legislative act, such as the Roe v. Wade, which in the Roe v. Wade we find why women specifically don't vote for the right. But now we have essentially voted everybody's going to be oppressed. And that is not the fault of the woman. That is the fault of specifically poorly made legislations over centuries of poorly made said legislations, which upon these poorly made legislations, if there's not a better, greater individual at specifically creating a constant within said legislation, we arrive at each individual interpreting said legislation at the interpersonable level, the individual, and in interpersonating said legislation and interpreting said legislation according to how you might veer in your own moral compass, where you might then see that you see a bias in how you could see and use said legislation. Thank you.